Scott, welcome to the show. I want to start off by asking you a little bit about who you are. You used to be a criminal prosecutor in Alberta, but you quit. Why would you do that?
It certainly wasn't about the job itself. I loved being a prosecutor, but literally, as I've told people, I got tired of tripping over the mistakes of the parole system in my courtroom, Ezra, and in particular on a bunch of fairly high-profile cases that were brought to my attention that dealt with people who should never have been on the streets in the first place, and having to try to explain to victims' families about how it was that this person that the justice system had let go, despite their long history of repeating crimes over and over and over and over again. I realized that if I was going to try to change that, I was going to have to do it by trying to change some laws. And so that led in 1992, I guess, that led me going and working with the Canadian Police Association, the national organization representing all of the frontline police officers in Canada. And we were very much involved in exactly that, criminal justice policy reform, focusing on corrections. I've spent years after that doing that with the Ontario government as well too. I spend most of my time now really on border security after 9/11, but from time to time I still do some work with victims groups and with police organizations on the criminal justice reform, which is still very much needed.
I think you're right. I mean, I think the cops in Canada generally do a good job of catching the bad guys. But once they're handed to the courts, I mean, I'm a lawyer by profession. I don't really do a lot these days. I remember the very first time I was in docket court, just small criminal court. Yeah. Someone had been convicted of sexually assaulting a child. They were babysitting. And he got a 6-month sentence. He would be out in 30 days. 30 days. I was shocked. I thought I had witnessed a scandal. This was considered normal. Now tell me, if someone gets a 6-month sentence for a sexual assault, is that low? And to be out on day parole, do we still allow that? Like, this was 15 years ago when I was a law student. Was that truly a scandal, or was that business as usual, as I've come to think it was?
Back in those days, that was probably more business as usual. I think it's improved in the context of what the sentence would be. And as you know, in our system, we generally deal with this offender, this offense. Sort of it's circumstance specific, with some exceptions with the government's brought in relation to mandatory minimum sentences. But I gotta tell you, the dominating reality of our criminal justice system is that there's a disproportionately small number of offenders responsible for a disproportionately large volume of crime. And when you deal with those people, either operationally or by legislation, you get huge public safety results. That's probably the thing that is most frustrating, I think you'll see with police organizations around the country, is that they realize that they're dealing with the same people over and over and over again, and that the justice system is all too frequently a revolving door or a merry-go-round.
Right.
And it's changes like that that actually need to get implemented.
All right, well, work with me. Let's say someone was convicted of a violent offense and got, instead of 6 months, let's say 6 years.
Right.
Let's say the cops did their job, caught him. The prosecutor did their job, prosecuted him. The jury and the judge, fine, 6 years. Now tell me, what's the likelihood of that violent criminal actually serving 6 years or 4 or 3 or 2 or 1? What are the different stages of parole, mandatory release, stuff like that 6-year sentence was actually turned into?
Well, let me start by, this is what's known as corrections math. And it starts, first of all, with whether or not the individual was denied bail. In our criminal code, logically, we have, there's a presumption that people will be granted bail if they're charged, but there are exceptions to that. In Section 719 of the criminal code, it actually authorizes judges that they can take into account any time that somebody spent in custody before they were convicted. Now, it was originally drafted so that if the person was denied bail because of just being charged with that offense, then the idea was that it was fair that you would take that into account. The criminal code under the bail sections, however, also says, well, wait a minute, we're not going to automatically grant bail to everybody. And so if you have a long history of committing crimes over and over and over again, or of breaching bail orders, we're not going to grant you bail. About 10, 12 years ago in Ontario, judges started awarding people denied bail because of their criminal history, started awarding them credit for that time served, and even extra credit, sometimes at a 2 or 3 to 1 ratio. So what we ended up doing perversely was literally rewarding career criminals when they were sentenced. So the first thing you need to do whenever you see a sentence is see whether or not there's any time taken off of that for time that's actually been served.
That's a great point, because if someone's so dangerous, we've got to keep them in jail. For that then to come off the sentence double or triple time, like you say, we're actually treating violent people better than we treat nonviolent.
And guess what? Guess who's figured that out?
Yeah, why?
The criminals and their lawyers. So you know what? don't ask for bail, you're going to get double or triple credit. Now, in fairness, the government has changed that. They didn't do it as well as I think they should have, but they've at least reduced the amount of credit that somebody can get. But let's go back to your 6-year sentence.
Okay.
This is Canada, so 6 years doesn't mean 6 years. Okay, you are eligible for parole after the expiration of 1/3 of the sentence.
Now that's full parole. That's go to your
Yes,
own
sir.
home. That's sleep in your own bed. That's you're out and about just checking
It depends.
with parole
Ezra,
afterwards.
it depends. There are conditions that can be placed on it, including having somebody placed into a community facility. But yes, potentially it does mean that. You're eligible for day parole, however, 6 months in advance of that full parole eligibility. So on a 6-year sentence, okay, eligible at 1/3, 2 years. Eligible 6 months in advance, 18 months. Oh, and by the way, you're also eligible for temporary absences literally from the moment you walk into the place, although those are on defined grounds and theoretically with some restrictions about who has to actually approve it. So full parole at 1/3. In Canada, we have something called statutory release, which means that you are presumptively entitled as a right to be released at not more than 2/3 of your entire sentence. There is a process by which a rarely used process, I might add. My understanding is there's about maybe 4 or 5% of the total sentences of where somebody can be kept for their full sentence. But in Canada, no matter how many times you violated your parole, no matter what your criminal record is, no matter how many times you violated your parole by committing new offenses, with some exceptions, you are still statutorily entitled to be released at not more than 2/3 of the sentence.
I don't get that. Like that's just a dumb blanket rule that says everything the judges say discounted by 1/3. Like seriously, when did that law come in, and how could tough on crime Vic Taves and Stephen Harper abide that? I mean, I would put it to you that 95% of Canadians have never heard of statutory release.
Correct.
And you could sum up statutory release in one sentence like you did. It's an automatic rule that you get out after only serving 2/3 of your time, if you were kept in that long anyways.
Yeah.
So why is this rule on the books?
It used to be known as mandatory supervision, and in the old days, used to describe it as being partially true. It was mandatory. I'm not so sure about the supervision. The idea is, I mean, look, about 40 years ago, Ezra, we moved from a penal system that focused on punishment to a correction system that focused on rehabilitation, and I think that makes very good sense. Where I think our system fails, however, is in differentiating between, fortunately, the majority of offenders that we still have a legitimate prospect for and hope of rehabilitation, and the people who commit crimes over and over and over and over again. Okay, all those people do, in my opinion, are using things like statutory release as a head start to commit more crimes. And that's something that needs to be changed. The government committed towards doing it in 2006. The idea, I think, would be that you make early release from custody a privilege to be earned rather than a right to be demanded.
Absolutely. 5 years and 6 years, we're still waiting for that promise to be kept. I hope it will be. Scott Newark, don't go away. I got more questions for you after the break.
Sure.